So very welcome to this conversation with our guest here, who has been introduced by Fernando Claro, and thank you also Juan Pablo Couyoumdjian for being here with us.
Thank you, Axel.
Having a profound conversation about, well, many aspects we will develop in this next 40 minutes, 30 minutes, and then you will have the chance to make questions. So I would like to start by asking you, Mike, a very general question, but nevertheless very important. In your view, what should the role of government be? Like, why? I mean, we have this debate going on in Chile, and we all the time hear people saying, "Oh, the market is failing. Government has to intervene there, has to intervene here, and so on and so forth, and it has to provide for the poor, and it has to provide free healthcare, and it has to provide everything." So, in your view, what should be government doing, and what should not do?
Well, as you said, it is a profound question. The answer to it, I think, is very difficult, and a mistake that many countries have made, and I know the US is making this mistake, is to try to use simple ideologically motivated answers instead of trying to work on problems. So there's a story that we tell in North Carolina, which is kind of a country state. There was at the state fair, the farmers would bring in their pigs, and there was a contest to see what was the prettiest pig. And the way the story goes, they bring the first pig out, and it's so ugly. The judge says, "Nope, forget it, that's so ugly, we're going to give the prize to the second pig, unseen." Now, I think both sides make this mistake. So a lot of people who are pro-market point out all the mistakes the state can make and say, we should have no state. Well, that's pretty unpersuasive. But some people will say, look at the mistakes that the market makes, therefore the state should provide everything. That's also a mistake. So I think the answer that the kind of political science that I do, the kind of economics that I do, which is called public choice, is to try to work on consensus. So groups of people have to try to work together to decide what the right split is between the state and the market. But there's another group that leaves out, and that is the voluntary private organizations that churches and clubs and local organizations work with schools. So this is a pretty unsatisfying answer to your question, because it'd be nice if I could say the market or the state. Right. But the answer is people have to try to work together seriously rather than accusing the other side of acting badly. Because if we're stuck in the pretty pig contest where everybody says, you made a mistake, therefore my side wins, then we're not going to make any progress.
Public choice is usually said to be a bit pessimistic about government and seeing lots of government failure. And yet, if I understand what you just said correctly, there is an important role for politics in choosing in groups, to mention the title of your latest book. And so what's the role in this choosing groups of a representative democracy versus what is now very popular, deliberative democracy, especially in Chile nowadays, and communitarian groups or things like that?
Well, you've asked three pretty large questions, so I'll try to give insufficient brief answers to each of them. The first question that you ask is about public choice, and after James Buchanan won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1986, Alistair Cook from BBC News said that public choice is the homely but important truth that politicians are, after all, not so different from you and me. That is, someone who works in the private sector may be after profits and personal gain. Someone who enters the public sector is probably not all that different. Many people who work in the private sector do good work. Many people who work in the public sector do good work. So pointing out that people are motivated by incentives is where public choice starts. But another really important thing that public choice does is say that politics is an exchange process. And politics has a very specific definition. Now think for a second, how would you define politics? Well, I think that the correct definition for politics is when a group constitutes itself and says, here's the rules that we're going to use to decide things. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau asked this really great question. How can a man be both free and yet bound by wills not his own? How can a man be both free and yet bound by wills not his own? The answer is, we all agree to the rules, not necessarily to the outcomes, but we agree to the rules. Rules matter more than they should in political decision making. That's why the rules are so important. So if we follow the rules, I am bound to accept the outcome, even if I disagree with it. That's what politics means. But that's why the legitimacy of the process is so central. In the United States right now, the election that we're suffering through, I think a lot of people feel like, I mean, the US has often been a beacon to the world for democracy, and now we're a sort of a before picture. Don't do this, because it's not working out very well. I think a lot of people feel like the rules are not being followed, and that means that you're no longer bound to accept the outcomes. That's when people start asking questions. That's when people say, I don't think this process is legitimate. So the other question you asked was about deliberative democracy, and I think that's really important, but we can't deliberate as a nation. So what we've lost sight of is the importance of small groups of people working voluntarily on specific local problems. The question is, how can the state and how can the church, how can local comunas focus the creative energy of all the people that we have onto these problems? Because the French philosopher Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, said that he was worried that democracy enfeebled the charitable impulse that we have. As human beings, we like to cooperate. We like to work together, we like to solve problems. If we see a school that's failing, we say, how can we work on this? If we see poor people, we say, how can we get together contributions and help to feed them? But democracy in large groups that's not deliberative enfeebles that charitable impulse. And you see this a lot of the time in Europe. Tocqueville was worried about France, his home country. So I see a school that's provided by the state, and I feel like I paid my taxes. Well, the school's not very good. It's not my problem. I paid my taxes. I voted. I have satisfied my moral obligation. So the state can displace that cooperative charitable impulse. On the other hand, if everything's market-driven, and the school is for-profit, and we feel like they're working not for the people, but for their own sort of what public choice theorists call rent-seeking, that also can displace that charitable impulse, because I don't want to contribute to them because they're just out for themselves. So either the extreme market or the extreme state solutions, I keep coming back to the same ugly pig problem. Both of those two solutions leave out the voluntary private organizations that we actually depend on. So that's what we have to try to get back to, is get away from the false dichotomy of state versus market, and find a way to empower groups of people to work on the social problems that we all face.
Yes, but is it not the case that if you have a free society in the sense of a very limited government, a Jeffersonian type of government, so to speak, and you have therefore negative liberty, widespread negative liberty, you will have markets emerging as well as civil society organizations emerging. And so my point is it not government in the end, and I'm playing here a little bit of devil's advocate, the enemy, as of these organizations? Because it's not only the market that is going to be affected by government interventions, it's also, as you said, the civil society organizations. But that's basically because freedom is being restricted by the activity of government. So wouldn't it be better to have a kind of gnostic state for respecting the individuals and then expecting it to produce the results?
If we see the first job of the state to protect the ability of individuals to work together and cooperate and solve the problems that they face, I think that would be a giant step forward. If we see the job of the state as protecting markets, I think that's probably a mistake. So a lot of people on the left object to some of the things that the state does that provides protection from competition, discriminatory taxes. I mean, as Adam Smith said, seldom do people of business gather together, even for purposes of merriment, lest they conspire to raise prices and restrict output. So one way that I can increase my profits is to enlist the aid of the government.
Right.
So business and the government can form a corrupt deal. The question is how to limit the government to those activities that we, the civil society, not the business community, but the civil society wants. And that's a very difficult problem. The way that you ask the question, though, is the right one. If that's the question we're going to work on, I think we can make progress. What I worry about is people who say, all we need to do is do nothing and markets will emerge and they'll be perfect. And that's not true either.
Right.
And so again, on building on this and going back to the previous point, there's these communitarian and other critiques of the market now, which focus that it's taking over spaces of moral behavior, moral virtues, and there are some areas of our lives that simply cannot and should not be driven by market ideals, principles, or values. And so, what would your argument? That's sort of the Michael Sandelas is a typical author among these lines. And what would your argument be against this, or are they right? Is this a fair critique?
Again, I'll fall back on my hero, James Buchanan. James Buchanan had his own views on markets, and his claim was that in any voluntary exchange, we know for sure both of us are better off. Let me say that again, because it's a deep point. In a voluntary exchange, both of us are better off. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a voluntary exchange. So in that case, what we're looking for is for government to provide reductions in the transactions cost of us finding and transacting, because the more of those that happen, the greater the increase in welfare, the more access we have to voluntary exchange. Now, the objection that people have made is many exchanges are not really voluntary because people may be compelled not by force, but by circumstance. That is, the very poor don't really have many other choices. So the question is, in the way that you asked it, is can we really expect markets to serve the purpose of enhancing this voluntary cooperative activity in a circumstance where we have great inequalities in the society? And if you look at the societies, the economies along the Pacific Rim that have now achieved kind of a middle-class living standard, many of them started out with sweatshops. Now, a sweatshop is, in the United States at least, we call a sweatshop a place where the working conditions, the wages, the safety are all they're not up to US standards. So there's an interesting paradox. Suppose you think that it's exploitative for workers to work in a sweatshop. There's a bunch of Duke students I teach at Duke University, and many of them have t-shirts and sweatshirts. They have Duke on them. And many of them are purchased from countries where workers work in situations that are not nearly as nice as they would be in the United States. So maybe they're sweatshops. Let's concede that they're sweatshops. Would a solution be, so the students would say, we should not buy from those factories because they're exploitative. Well, suppose I go into a sweatshop and I say, you're saved. I am the great white man. All of you are fired. Will they thank me? No, that's the best job that they can get. The reason they work in that sweatshop is the alternative is to sell their bodies, sell drugs, work in the fields. They'll be much worse off. So that experience of working in the sweatshops is where Taiwan started. It's where South Korea started. So I think the way to think of it is this. Suppose we were to do an ethical analysis of stoplights. So we're worried about traffic institutions. We're worried about stoplights. It is unfair that some people have red lights and some people have green lights. Well, that's pretty static. The fact is sometimes the light is green and sometimes it's red. We alternate, we take turns. So in a dynamic sense, starting out with sweatshops means that you actually can advance. But you have to be in a situation where property rights are secure, where the accumulation of productive resources can actually then be used to produce more factories and more jobs in the future. But every country that has made it out of poverty has done it by encouraging first what we might call sweatshops, then the development of a middle class, and then the concern for political rights and for the inequalities of income.
Yes, but someone could tell you, well, you know, it's not about closing the factories, it's about making laws and ensuring that they get a higher minimum wage or have sanitary conditions and all these things. So you go to Bangladesh and you have more or less a proxy of the standards you have in the first world. And why shouldn't Apple pay for this, for instance?
And that's a good question. So in the United States, there's a phenomenon called gentrification. So a poor neighborhood, some bearded young men, hipsters move in. They've got, I wasn't looking at you. They've got flannel shirts, they make pickles, they make their own beer, and before very long, the value of the neighborhood goes up. Well, the poor people have to move out. They can no longer afford to live in that neighborhood. If you create a situation where the jobs have better safety, shorter hours, you're going to get people, not the poor people that work there now, but you're going to get middle class, high school educated people, because those are much better jobs if they have better conditions. So you'll get job gentrification. The reason why people work in sweatshops is that's the position, the total amount of compensation. Safety, wages, work hours, all those things together. If you make it more expensive to hire them, you're going to have to hire someone who's more productive. Jobs can be gentrified too. And so companies that have tried this found that the poor people who used to work in their factories no longer can work there. So if your goal is to help the poor, that would be the last thing you would want to do. And it does seem paradoxical because I care about them. I want the poor people to do better. The paradox is me acting on that impulse makes them worse off. And it's not about me feeling good about myself. It's about actually helping the poor. Turns out the way actually to help them, to help the poor, is to put them on the first step on the ladder towards economic success. And that, surprisingly enough, is often a sweatshop.
And so there's a virtuous element, which is something you've worked on. There's a virtuous element in entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is not just creating efficiency or whatever, it's also something valuable in a moral sense, to put it that way.
Entrepreneurship is one of the hardest things to understand, and the question is, how do you encourage entrepreneurship? Now, I had a student in one of my large classes, and I talked about the nature of profits. And let me ask you this question. Just think to yourself, are profits evil? Now, Karl Marx argued that profits were evil because he claimed that the source of value was labor. But if you think that value is the subjective valuation that consumers place on a product, that is, I make a product, you want to buy it, and you'll pay me more than it cost me to make it. Two values are created there. One is the value that goes to my workers and the value that goes to me, the producer. But the other is the value that goes to the consumer. How would we measure the value that goes to the consumer? The value that goes to the consumer is the difference between how much they would pay and how much they have to pay. So how much value in the world do iPhones create? Well, a lot of people would pay $1,000, $2,000 US for an iPhone, and they cost $400. So each iPhone is creating more than $1,000 in value, if you measure it according to consumers, or the subjective value that consumers place on this. That's where value comes from, is the value consumers place on it. Now, Apple, the company, does take out some profits from the price that they receive. How would you decide if that profit is too much?
Right.
When are profits deserved? Well, they invented something that people really want to buy, and out of all the other smartphones, I guess right now it's a little hard for Galaxy, because one advantage of the iPhone is it doesn't catch fire. So that's a sort of a minimal.
That's not exploding planes.
Yeah, so, but normally you're comparing these along pretty different, pretty similar standards, and a lot of people like iPhones. Well, you can say it's too much, but you can also say people should always have green lights. We have to have a process for inventing and rewarding these things. Now, the question that Juan Pablo asked is, how would we know when something is entrepreneurship? And so one of the sort of icons of entrepreneurs is Steve Jobs, who tried to think of products that people really wanted to buy, and it turned out that he was right, except he made the Apple Newton and the company almost went bankrupt. Well, no one at that point said, how many losses are too much? They went, ha ha ha, losers. I mean, they made a bad product, they lost their shirts, that seems fair. Why isn't it fair to say sometimes they make a product a lot of people want to buy? Many other companies try to make similar products. Over time, the profits are competed down. I think the answer to the question is many times profits are not deserved. And I think people on my side, the pro-market people, should say that more often. So I will say it one more time. Often, accounting profits are not deserved. They're the results of patents. So maybe you're a patent troll, you've patented a piece of intellectual property or something that a phone does, and you sue anybody who doesn't pay you the license fee. That's not entrepreneurship. That's preventing the creation of value. Or maybe I get some anti-competitive restriction by paying members of Congress, by lobbying members of Congress. So the people on my side too often have said, no, profits are deserved, and therefore they shouldn't be taxed. Well, that's not true. Many profits, in fact, result from anti-competitive activities. So the ethical question is, how can we educate entrepreneurs? How can we sort of bring entrepreneurs into a sense of guild membership? That your job as an entrepreneur is to create value for the society, and your profits are the payoff for that if you succeed. But you're also sometimes going to lose because entrepreneurship is risky. What you should not be rewarded for is rent seeking. So rent seeking is the creation of an artificial barrier to entry. And often what in the US we see more and more of is I have a choice. As an entrepreneur, I can hire engineers who make stuff, or I can hire lawyers who prevent other people from making stuff.
Right.
Well, I'm going to invest in the second because that's where so many accounting profits come from. Our finance industry, much of the profits that they made 2007, 2008 came from the expectation of a bailout, came from favorable regulation from a government that didn't care at all about taxpayers and voters. Well, that's a problem. And again, I think my side ought to admit that more. Many of the things that the state does to protect markets illegitimately create profits that either should be taxed or shouldn't exist in the first place.
Which brings us to the inequality debate. No? If we assume that we have a free market where no one is benefiting from rent seeking, but you have enormous amounts of inequality in this society, is this a cause for concern first from an ethical point of view, and then from an economic point of view? Because we know some people argue when inequality is too profound, then the economy starts suffering and all these things. What do you think? What's your take on this? Are you would you endorse? I don't think you would, but like Piketty, for instance, to some extent, where he says, well, inequality is bad, or Sandel, he believes inequality is a bad thing by definition. He doesn't even provide a very good, reasoning to justify his position. But anyway, what would be your take on this argument that it's not fair that some people have too much, regardless of how they got their money, and others have not too much?
I think there's two separate problems that are often muddled together. One is the problem of poverty. I think poverty is a legitimate problem. Poor people do not have access to the means of providing for themselves and their family the thing that we associate with basic human dignity: housing, clothing, food, medical care, education. So poverty is a problem. The question is inequality a problem? And if so, why? Why would inequality be a problem? Here's the difficulty. Almost every nation that has solved the problem of poverty has done it by increasing its inequality. So the way to solve poverty is not to take money from some people and give it to others. It's to create jobs so that the overall size of the pie increases for everyone. But that means that the share of those who get lucky in the entrepreneurial process is going to increase pretty dramatically, because people are constantly looking around for ways to create something that other people are going to value. Most of them fail, we don't hear any more from them. Some of them succeed, and they get very, very wealthy. So the way to solve the problem of poverty is a free market-oriented system where the state doesn't protect the losers. And the problem, as I said, in the United States, our government has protected the large financial firms that lost. And as a result, we have a crony capitalist system. We don't have a free market system. So the US is not a model on this. But if you look at the countries that have managed to, that were poor and have worked their way out of it, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China. The huge increases in inequality in China. But they're also working their way out of poverty. For the first time in hundreds of years, China now has a middle class. So I worry that when we think about inequality, we're thinking of it in a static sense. Everybody should have a green light. Instead of, let's have a process where we manage this best we can. And some people are going to win the lottery. Some people are going to end up with quite a bit of money. That's the price we pay for solving the price of poverty. So the way to get rid of poverty is to make more wealthy the poor people. The way to get rid of inequality is to make less wealthy the rich people. That doesn't help the poor people at all, unless you take the sin of envy and raise it to the status of a social virtue.
Right, which is what to some extent Piketty understand when he argues for 85% taxes.
It is something that intellectuals often get trapped in. You know, I went to college, I made a lot of good grades, and I worked really hard. But there's this entrepreneur, maybe he sells used cars, and he's really rich, and he made B's in school. Why don't I make all the money? Well, the answer is he's actually working, and no one knows what I do. I'm a professor. But I mean, we think smart people should make more money than people who create value and maybe just get lucky. And the thing is, there's a big element of luck in it. If I find something that's useful for the society, it doesn't matter if it was luck or not. I was looking because I was looking to make profits, and the society benefits as a result. So it's not deserved. So many philosophers want a theory of desert. They say unless you deserve this wealth, the state's going to take it. Well, it's not clear why the state deserves it either. That's not a theory of desert. What it should be is a theory of entitlement. And I said before, this is, we agree on the rules, and then we accept the outcome even if we disagree with them. Well, the rule is you are entitled to to a portion of the wealth that you create. Now, I may disagree with the outcome because it increases inequality, but it helps poverty by more. So I think that there's a mistake that's being made, and I'm not saying they're doing it on purpose, but there's a confusion about the importance of poverty compared to inequality.
And so on this, because normally there's the idea that there's lots of poverty, there's lots of inequality, and government is ways by which the population, the voters, tend to desire to improve things. It's to make things better. And we act collectively through politics, and we ask government to solve the problems we are facing as society. And I think it's a natural impulse. We want good government, social policies, or whatever policies to help the needy and the people who are in trouble. And yet this fundamental impulse sometimes is misguided. Sometimes these good intentions don't end up in good results.
I ran for governor of the state of North Carolina in 2008. I ran as a libertarian. I did not win. I came in third, but it was an interesting experience because I was in 4 televised debates with the real candidates. And in a way, I'm their worst nightmare because I have a certain superficial glibness. I have a PhD in economics, and I had no chance of winning. So I was able to answer the questions. It was interesting to watch, though, voters' reaction to answers to questions, because people would say, here's this very difficult problem. And I'd say, that's actually a very difficult problem. You look at the social science on this, it's not clear what the answer is. Both of the other candidates said, I know the solution to this problem. It is simple thing X. And voters say, oh, that's what I'm going to pick that. Because they want someone who has an answer. So generally, we've got this sort of problem. Let's suppose that we think Y, I don't know what it is, but Y is a problem. Our first impulse is to think we should do something. Mm-hmm. Well, X is something, therefore we should do X. That doesn't follow. I mean, Y is a problem, we should do something, X is something, therefore we should do X. But if I say, well, actually that won't work and it'll make things even worse, they say, well, you just hate people who suffer from Y. Right. So if you say poverty is a problem, we should do something, and subsidized housing is something that we can do, even though it traps people in bad housing, and if they get a job, they lose their benefit. So the marginal tax rate is close to 100%. So it's actually a bad policy. People say, well, you just hate poor people. Well, no, your policy, the one that you're advocating, actually is the one that's harming poor people. So the philosophers have a principle called non-worseness. Non-worseness just means that if you have a policy that you want to apply because you want to help someone, at least it shouldn't hurt them. It shouldn't make them worse off. It's not about you. So the difficulty that we have is separating this impulse to do something and the political, because if you say we have to do something, there's some politician that's going to say, I'll do something, even though maybe there's two possibilities. Either the person knows it won't work and they're a liar, or they don't know that it won't work and they're a fool. Because many of these policies won't actually work. So I have my own view on this, and there's a libertarian movement in the United States saying if we add up all of the money that we spend on social programs, on poverty programs, and divide by the number of poor people, that amount is about $15,000 or $16,000 per person. So for a family of 3, that's more than $40,000. That's above the poverty line. Get rid of all the programs and give the poor people the cash, instead of all this hodgepodge of different programs, because we don't trust people. So I've been in favor of universal basic income. And we can finance it from the existing programs that we have all these different, that are the accretion, the accumulation over time of all of these, we should do something. We should do something, we should do something. We've done a lot, we're spending a ton. Just give people the cash. So I think universal basic income is an answer that satisfies all sides on this, because it means that we're actually giving people the means to try to make their own decisions, that they will no longer be in poverty. Now, the objection often is, yes, but poor people need smart white people like me to order them around. You know how they are. They're not smart enough
and
to
it
know.
comes from the left, which is
Absolutely,
pretty interesting.
absolutely. It comes. Well, the left and the right both have that view, and so to be fair, a lot of our welfare policies are an attempt to help people with poverty, but then you add on all of these things to make sure, well, if the person gets a job, if the person gets married, they lose their benefits. So it's a combination of perfectly understandable impulse. The left, actually, I think they really do want to help people, and the right wants to make sure that no one is getting these benefits unfairly. The result is the benefits don't actually help anyone, but they're really expensive. So I think we should smoke out the paternalism of both sides. Give them the money, and then recognize some of them are going to make bad choices. Many of them, though, if they just get a chance, if they can get a job, if they can get access to childcare and education, the next generation won't be poor. So right now we're losing all the poor people because they're trapped in a cycle of poverty. A universal basic income means we could save 10, 20%. There's plenty of ambitious people who, given a chance, will use their native creativity.
So the structure of the income would be just like dividing the total pie of government spending, or more like negative income tax?
Like, negative income tax.
Right.
So it's not all government spending, just the poverty programs.
Right.
Although we could also give them some of our military spending too.
Yeah,
that would be fine with me.
That wouldn't harm. So we are going to open soon to the floor, so they can also make some questions. But I have a last question, and then you, Juan Pablo, if you want also. This shows us that it's not so easy to make America great again. So my question would be, because...
What the hell is wrong with you?
You have someone who has answers for everything, running for president. So he knows how to fix everything, you know? So my question would be, how much can we trust democracy in the end? Because this sort of Trumpian mentality, or in the end, it prevails somehow, many times, or more than it should prevail. So how can we, or is it the battle of ideas, as Hayek would say, and so people should get more aware of what they are doing when they vote, or are there institutional constraints so a Trump doesn't make it? What do you think about it?
One of the problems with democracy at a large scale is that there's very little incentive for voters to become well informed about the alternatives because their vote doesn't determine the outcome. And so it makes sense for them to cast their vote based on emotional attachments or a sense of feeling good about expressing solidarity with some group they identify with. Now, one solution to that would be to have institutions that are called parties that simplify and focus the debate between two coherent, competing visions of government. In the United States, our parties are so weak and so permeable that it's possible for outsiders to come in. Now, one of the interesting things about this was this was the result of the progressive reforms in the United States from about 1890 to 1920. Before that, the metaphor that you've probably heard is that the candidates for the parties were chosen in a smoke-filled room. The smoke-filled room was, cigar smoke, and white men who were rich choose the candidates. That's a pretty bad system. But it turns out that asking primary voters, because remember, primary voters are the most extreme 10% of the Republicans and the most extreme 10% of the Democrats. Asking them to choose candidates is also a really bad idea. So we, the United States, have long sort of claimed that our system of democracy is not just defensible, but other people should imitate it. Mm-hmm. I wonder if we don't need stronger parties. So I think the answer is not, we can't blame voters. But voters are in a situation where they're making choices among alternatives that are not very good. So frankly, I think the choice between Trump and Clinton is not a very good choice. What we need is institutions that direct their voters' energies in a better way. Something more like a German, French, or even British system where the parties have more say over who their candidates are would help us. And to be fair, the Democrats did this. After 1972, after the election had gone so badly and George McGovern had gotten just wiped out in the presidential race, the Democrats included a bunch of superdelegates. So superdelegates basically bring partially back the smoke-filled room. There's elites that are making choices between the candidates. And the Republicans always said, we don't need to do that, we're a very strong party, and now they wish they had them because their choice was trumped.
So, thank you, Axel, for the invitation. And just to close, we've been talking a lot about politics, and I see an overarching field or subject that encompasses what we're talking about, which is political economy in terms of mixing politics and economy, but it's also related, and I think it's a more important thing, with what we call, or you call in the US, PPE. And I know you've been director of the PPE program at Duke, and maybe you can talk about how this politics, philosophy, and economics is the real overarching area or field where we should examine these kinds of problems.
Philosophy, politics, and economics was established at Oxford University in 1925. Until then, Oxford had a program called Greats. So it was great books, the classics, and the British thought, we're not really producing people who are capable of running an empire. And so the Oxford refocused on PPE, and a surprising number of prime ministers and members of parliament in many countries come from a PPE background. I would say in some ways it's not so much new as it is a return to the idea of political economy that we would have had in the 18th century during the Scottish Enlightenment. So the distinction we make between philosophy, politics, and economics would just mystify David Hume or Adam Smith. Why would you think those are different subjects? And some of the answer is that there's been academic returns to specialization. But we need students and leaders who are better than professors, not that that's very hard. So the way to do that is to encourage our students to work on some of the unanswered questions. So economists say, we're not going to think about ethics, and philosophers say, we're not going to worry about practical problems. Well, what could possibly go wrong with that dichotomy? I mean, it means that you actually can't work on problems like deciding how we're going to regulate prices, whether or not we're going to try to solve problems with the environment, because economists look only at efficiency and philosophers look only at problems of ethics. So PPE sort of brings those two things back together. So some of what PPE is to help us refocus on unanswered questions like that. But something else that PPE can do is problematize some of the unquestioned answers. So a lot of the things that we've just concluded about markets, and like I said, I would blame my own side for doing this, that markets are what happen in the absence of any kind of state interference, that's just not true. There's all sorts of underpinning, providing a system for adjudicating disputes over property rights, for defining property rights, providing a system of currency, for us to just to accept, as economists often do, an abstraction from real-world institutions that provide the underpinnings in which market transactions can take place and provide mutual benefits is one of the things that I think PPE brings back. So PPE is expanding all over the world, but there's now 57 PPE programs in the United States, and 20 of those are new in the last 2 years. So I think that in some ways all we're doing is bringing back the notion that these things are together from the 18th century rather than inventing something new.
Great. So we are going to open preguntas. Por favor, tratar de mantenerla breve, que no sean muy largas para que todos puedan preguntar.
Hi. Hi, Michael. My name is Gonzalo. I will ask a question about a very interesting case in the US. The last June, Orlando, a shooter make a battery, for say. And many authorities say that it's necessary a gun control in the country to avoid the gun violence. On the other hand, the NRA said that gun control doesn't decrease the gun violence and is just about control but not about guns. Do you believe that the gun control will decrease the gun violence?
Well, this is a big question, and we could have an entire discussion of it. In terms of full disclosure, let me say I'm a member of the NRA. I own many guns. And I think we should have more gun control. Because the US system ignores, I may be the only person who thinks that, but the US system ignores the fact that the Second Amendment has two parts. So the first part talks about a well-regulated militia being necessary for the safety of a free state, and then it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the First Amendment, remember, says Congress will make no law. That's different from mentioning well-regulated. So the NRA has fought any sort of sensible regulation, and the left has want to ban all guns, which the Supreme Court has said won't work. So I think registration, background checks, training, I think it should be like a driver's license. So your right to drive is contingent on you behaving responsibly and getting training, demonstrating that you've achieved a certain level of training. So I do a lot of gun training myself. I have a concealed carry permit. I do a lot of work with trying to teach people about guns. I think that something more like a driver's license. That is, you have to be qualified, and you can lose it if you behave irresponsibly. But here's the problem with the sort of other side that would say what we should do is get rid of guns. Maybe we should make murder illegal. Oh wait, it is illegal already, and yet a murder still happened. So the point is, if someone wants to commit murder, they're likely to be willing to break the gun laws on the way to doing it. Having laws against guns will just keep law-abiding citizens like me from having them. They won't keep criminals from having them. So a more sensible system modeled on something like a driver's license, where we do have the sensible regulations that now many places lack. The state of Florida, where I grew up, if you cross the border, the police say, "Do you have a gun?" And if you say no, they give you one. Okay, that's not true, but concealed carry, anybody can carry a concealed weapon. You don't have to have any training, any background, it's nuts. So I think part of the reason that things like Orlando might happen in Florida is the absence of even sensible regulation. So it's hard to look at one or two incidents and say, let's stop those. But the prevalence of gun violence might be reduced by having a more sensible system of laws modeled on driver's licenses.
Espérate que está Fernando y después Raimundo.
You ran for governor in next year. We have presidential elections here in Chile, and there are some parties that are thinking about have a testimonial candidate. Do you think it will?
A testimonial is like someone who makes the case, like a Ron Paul kind of guy.
Yeah.
Well, one of the theories about third parties is third parties partly blackmail the major parties into remembering their actual policy positions. And they also are a way of introducing new policies. So the reason I think that having a more open electoral system is nice, is useful for the voters, is that in the United States we're probably always going to have two parties. But who's to say which two parties those are? So it's different to say we have two parties, many other parties have been able to enter, and these were the two that voters most selected, or saying we're going to have rules that saying we're only having two parties. So having other candidates in debates and having access to the public, it's partly a testimonial, but it also means that I get to confront the candidates. I had a different status. So when I'm in the debates, I was in the middle and the other two candidates were on the outside. And so when they asked questions, I also got to ask questions. And they would like to restrict the conversation to the things that they disagree about, because there's a bunch of things that they agree about and don't want to bring up. So having a testimonial candidate means they don't get to decide what questions they have to confront. Having another candidate means you don't have to just rely on the media or voters, you actually have someone on the stage to be able to ask those sorts of questions. And if nothing else, it just makes things seem more open and accessible.
We have one question back there.
Yes. My question goes about the relation between market process and democracy. Do you think that is it illegitimate for that democracy be run by market logics, like, for example, buying and selling votes, and what has the public choice theory has to say about that?
Again, that's a really big question. So in the United States, just a few years ago, we had a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. And Citizens United basically opened up the system to direct contributions from the treasuries of corporations, not contributions, but expenditures. And so the question is, what is the relationship between money and speech? Well, in a large country, if I have an opinion and I want to express it, the only way other people can hear it is if I have enough money either to buy ads or I have an institution like parties to give me access to the agenda where I can get people's attention. So money is crucial for third-party candidates to be able to participate. Money is crucial for outsiders to be able to raise questions. But the distribution of money is not equal. So the people who have money tend to be ones who have interest in the current system. So I think the public choice response to this would be restrictions on spending are more likely to benefit incumbents. Restrictions on spending are more likely to benefit incumbents. Incumbents have a big advantage because they already have office. If they show up to give a speech, you say, oh, the governor's giving a talk. Whereas if the governor's opponent shows up, people say, oh, some politician is giving a talk. So they don't get covered very much. The only way challengers can get attention is to be able to spend money. The problem is, in order to receive that money, they may have to make promises to where the money is. So I think the United States has gotten itself into a difficult position where we may be doing exactly the wrong thing. So let me give you an example. We have disclosure laws. So the disclosure laws say that anyone who contributes more than $200 has their name printed. Well, that means if I make a contribution and my boss disagrees with it, I may be retaliated against. But corporations can give money and nobody knows where it's coming from. So it seems odd that we would punish individuals but focus on making sure that large corporations can make contributions without any sort of accountability. I think the United States has gotten itself into a difficult position. On the other hand, our elections are relatively open. So I have a student who is from China, and he was pretty brave. He did a bunch of interviews with people back in China about what did they think about Donald Trump. Now, the Chinese government position about Donald Trump is, well, it's just American politics and capitalism as usual. Some rich guy is running for office. But what many Chinese people see is this guy who is not a party insider was able to use money to break through and win the nomination in one of the parties. That could never happen in China. So in a way, we are open. Donald Trump is the best and the worst of the American system. I tend to think the worst right now. But in the sense that an outsider can break in because money allows more competition, more outside ideas, even if, as in this case, the ideas are terrible.
We have, there.
Hello, I would like you to expand on a point you made earlier. What should the role of charity be in Latin American countries, and how can
the role of what?
Of charity, and how can civil society organizations help the poor in the areas where governments are failing? What are the best policies that we can do as individuals?
Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America wrote about the way that American society constantly is organized in associations. So there's associations to fix schools, there's associations to work on roads, to pick up garbage, to clean up some area. The question is, how do you get that ethic where a group of people don't wait for the state to do something? So there was a famous example in Africa where there was a large sump, a hole in the ground that would fill with rainwater, and there might be a dead cow in it, so there was a lot of disease. So what they wanted to do was get rid of this drainage area because it was producing a lot of mosquitoes. A Dutch company came in and installed a pump that you could pump by hand, and so you could drain this filthy water out. They came back a year later and the pump was broken. They asked, I mean, it's pretty easy to fix, why didn't you do it? And they said, well, we asked the state to fix it and nobody did anything. They didn't have the sense that they as individuals were empowered to try to solve this problem. So I don't know how you create it, but I do think that one of the things the state can do is displace the impulse for charity that already exists. The more the state says, we're going to take care of all of society's needs, we are going to provide for the poor, we're going to provide for education, will displace people's natural charitable impulse. In the United States, we've started to see this happen. This used to be an activity of the church. Many churches would engage in this. They already had infrastructure providing it. That's true here also. So I worry about the conflict between the church as a social organization and the state as a coercive entity in conflict with each other, when what we need to do is try to find a way to get them to cooperate. I don't know the answer to how to do that. It needs to be done community by community. But I worry that the state is going to enfeeble that impulse that people naturally have, to the point where if you see a problem, you say, darn it, the state should do something, and not I should do something. I have the moral responsibility of trying to help people who are in trouble.
So let's take 2 more questions. Okay, 3. Okay, 4. No.
I'll just make my answer shorter.
Yeah. So who was next?
Hi. Well, I've always had the idea that a good idea will sell itself, you know? But sadly, I don't see it like happening constantly, because I see my country or see what happens in the US, and good ideas suddenly are not like what people want, because I see a crowd completely alienated, I don't know how to say it, but alienated by quick solutions and things that they want. But how can we educate people to understand that quick solutions are not the best solutions, and that the good solutions require time or effort or something like that.
I don't know that we can educate people to do that because that's a natural human impulse. What we might be able to do is set up institutions that limit the damage that's done by that impulse. So the sort of institutions that I'm thinking about are responsible parties that have more of a connection in the community rather than just being seen as sort of political corporations. And honestly, right now, Germany is solving that problem pretty well. Germany is having a big problem with immigration. They're going to have some difficulties, but a lot of the local party organizations are actually not waiting. They're putting together food banks and shelter for immigrants. So it's not impossible. I think that education is not the answer. We always, what people usually mean by education is make other people act as if they agreed with me, because I know what to do. I think what we need is institutions that limit the damage that democracy can do, and at the risk of, I'm sure most of you know this, but we need to be reminded, Plato was very skeptical of the notion of democracy because democracy means mob rule. So if we take one person who doesn't know enough to govern himself and gather a bunch of them into an unruly mob, we think now we have something. Now these people are able to govern all of us. So I think what voters need, the reason to have elections is to give voters a chance to choose between good alternatives that are selected by responsible institutions. I don't know how we can get back to that, and the last place you would look is the US, because we have just botched it. So I hope y'all can do better.
Teníamos una pregunta hace rato aquí adelante. Vamos a hacer después de esta una más y cerramos.
Hi, how are you? My name is Ignacio. Well, I'm gonna do the question in Spanish because I think it will be faster and easy for me.
The problem is my Spanish, so I apologize.
And it has some technical words that I don't know at this moment. Maybe Axel can translate after my question.
Yes.
Yeah, ¿qué piensas sobre la crisis de Estados Unidos del año 1929 y la del 2008? La de 1929, se piensa que fue producto digamos, del capitalismo, ¿no es cierto?, que fue lo que llevó como al fin de esa crisis, y que, fueron más bien políticas más socialistas que permitieron sacar adelante o superar esa crisis. Y en la del 2008, creo que hasta hoy en día existen discusiones con respecto a si la crisis del 2008 fue causada por el Estado o por el mercado. No tengo entendido que Axel ha escrito mucho sobre eso, también puede tener alguna opinión sobre eso. Y yo he escuchado que si bien no he estudiado muy en profundidad el tema, he escuchado que la crisis del 2008 fue causada por el capitalismo, principalmente por los bancos, y que el principal problema fue algo como la tasa de encaje, ya que la tasa de encaje fue el problema. Y no sé, en resumen estas crisis fueron causadas por el capitalismo o por el socialismo.
So the question would be, can we blame capitalism for the 1929 crash and the 2008 crash? You know, in English, everything is shorter. What's your take on that?
The short answer is yes, if you think you can blame dogs for eating out of the garbage. It's what dogs do. The question is, why was the garbage there? So what happened in 1929 was there were incentives given for over-leveraging of the ownership of assets. And in the response to the stock market crash, the Federal Reserve, and there's pretty much a consensus among economists on this, and Paul Krugman and Milton Friedman agree completely, the Federal Reserve dramatically reduced the money supply at exactly the time they needed to be increasing it. And so there would have been a crash in 1929, but the depth and duration of the crash were caused by a mistaken government policy. So you're always going to get a business cycle, but 1929 was probably the worst government policy in the history of the American economy. Now, the question is, what happened in 2008? What happened in 2008 was actually what happened in 2006. Two government corporations, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, agreed to buy debt, mortgages that were not, there was no chance of them being repaid. So a bunch of mortgages that there was no income, the house was overvalued. What happened was that the local loan originator was able to make this loan and then immediately sell it to the government. So they had no reason to take care of these mortgages. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac repackaged them in commoditized debt obligations, CDOs. Those CDOs were supposed to be a liquid asset that would trade on the market that people could then use as there'd be a secondary market in mortgages. That choice to do that and to change the definition, the FHA changed the definition of a qualifying mortgage. Used to be that you could only have 30% of your monthly income to pay for your rent. That was eliminated. So now you could have 100% of it. So there was no chance of these mortgages being repaid. Many, many people bought these commoditized debt obligations because they were being sold by the US federal government. Now, absolutely a bunch of charlatans and fraudulent banks put together as many of these as they could. So it's a problem of capitalism. But why would you let dogs eat out of the garbage? The government caused this in the sense that they enabled this fraud. So I blame the government in the sense that you would expect fraudulent activities from some market participants if they can get away with it. So we needed better regulation, not more regulation. This is a very heavily regulated market. We needed a regulation that was not bought and paid for by the banks. And the response to this, Dodd-Frank made things worse, not better. Dodd-Frank has a bunch of reporting requirements that make it very difficult for small, nimble, new competitors to enter this market. But large companies that already exist have their profits protected by this regulation. So you look at the people who've got the largest number of contributions from Wall Street, and it's Barney Frank, Christopher Dodd, and Hillary Clinton. They're the ones who get most of the contributions from Wall Street. Hillary Clinton has a well-documented history with Wall Street. She is the candidate of Wall Street. Wall Street is not new companies that don't exist yet. Wall Street is the large companies that are trying to protect themselves from competition. So that's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. So maybe we can agree that crony capitalism did cause both of these. But no free market advocate would ever say that's the way the system should work. We should be able to agree, let's get rid of that. So but basic answer to your question is yes.
¿Había alguna pregunta, Mike? ¿Cerramos o vamos? Estamos. Había una. Bueno. So, thank you, Mike, for being here with us. It has been fantastic to have this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you again in Chile, hopefully very soon. And I take it you will not vote for Trump or Hillary, so...
I will vote for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate.
Right, it's my candidate too. Así que démosle un aplauso a Mike y agradecemos.